Hello, everybody. How are we doing today? Good, yay! All right. So, okay, that was me being me. Now I'm going to be official. So, good afternoon. I'm Stacy Sinclair, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel presentation in the Inequality Science Series. It's organized by Nicole Shelton and myself, and generously supported by the Psychology Department, the Department of African American Studies, and the Princeton Center for Behavioral Science and Public Policy. The lecture series was developed with the aim of bringing together leading researchers and students and academics and members of the community, and as well as administrators, to lead an exchange of ideas and also to discuss best practices with respect to inequality, diversity, and inclusion. This afternoon, we'll hear from two excellent social psychologists who examine how whites seek to maintain their privileged status while also maintaining a positive sense of self and not upsetting ethnic minorities. But before we hear from our wonderful speakers, I have the great pleasure of introducing Dean Deborah Prentice, who has agreed to be our moderator today. She will offer comments at the end of the talk, lead us in the Q&A, and she will also introduce our speakers, as for my introduction of her. So Deborah Prentice is Dean of the Faculty here at Princeton. She's been fantastic in her role as Dean of the Faculty and is beloved, from what I understand, by everyone with whom she works. But I think what makes her presence here particularly special is that in addition to being Dean, and giggling over there in the corner, she's Alexander Stewart, 1886, I know. Right, it's very Princeton, right? It has to be 1886. So 1886, professor of psychology and public affairs, and former chair of the psychology department. So in that role, as chair of the psychology department, Dr. Prentice led an expansion of our faculty, bringing sort of numerous wonderful new voices to our table. And as I wrote that line, I laughed myself, and I told myself I wouldn't say this, but I'm saying it, including me. So she, so she was the chair that hired me. So I'm forever grateful for that. And she also led our move from the old building in Green Hall to the beautiful structure that we find ourselves in now. So, in addition, Dean Prentice has illustrated an extended commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equality here on the Princeton campus. So, for example, she was co-chair of the Trustees Ad Hoc Committee on Diversity in 2013, and in her own research as a social psychologist, she studied biased perceptions of women. I literally could have gone on and on as I was writing, but I figured you didn't come to hear me. So if you could just join me in welcoming Dean Prentice. Thank you.
It's just so very funny to be introduced that way here, right? You can call me Debbie, it's fine. So now I'm the next wave of introductions, and you didn't come here to hear me either. So I'm going to be very brief, but in introducing our wonderful speakers for today, to give them the floor, and I will introduce them in the order from left to right, your right to left. I'm going to introduce one closest to me first, who is Eric Knowles. So Professor Eric Knowles, Associate Professor of Psychology at NYU. Eric received his PhD in social psychology from the University of California at Berkeley in 2003. And Professor Knowles' research examines the interplay between people's social identities and their political behavior. Most recently, he's examined how white sense of in-group identity shapes their policy attitudes and political preferences. For example, their support for the Tea Party movement. In other work, Professor Knowles is investigating how demographic changes in the United States are amplifying whites' in-group identity and the consequences of this development for politics. Eric Knowles is actually one of the first people, I think, who did serious and important work on the in-group identities of privileged white people, and it's been I've followed his work ever since he was a graduate student. For that reason, it's really excellent work. Our other speaker is Professor Brian Lowery. Brian's a professor of organizational behavior at Stanford University. But we all know he's actually a social psychologist. He received his doctorate from UCLA in 2001 with a minor in statistical methods. And Brian does research on two topics. One, he examines the operation of racial attitudes below the threshold of consciousness. He shares that interest with Stacy, actually, and they've done some work in concert. Brian's other main focus of research is on how people perceive inequality. Underlying both these lines of work is the assumption that individuals may unintentionally exacerbate existing inequity despite supporting the ideal of a just and fair society. Brian's teaching focuses on translating basic knowledge about human interactions into lessons for managers. He currently teaches introductory organizational behavior courses for both master's and doctorate level students at Stanford. In addition, he teaches a seminar on managing diversity. And so please join me in welcoming Eric Knowles and Brian Lowery.
All right, I'm gonna stand, is that okay? All right. I feel like I should be giving an introduction, but I don't have anybody to introduce but myself, and I wouldn't be that excited. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you today about, what Eric and I are both going to talk about, is hierarchy. I'm not going to give a... Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. I'm not going to give a very academic talk, so it's not going to be heavy on data. I will describe some studies, but I'm going to talk more about the general theory that I'm going to propose, right? And I think that Eric will follow up on. And the beginning of this theory is that human societies are organized hierarchically. Right? So as far as we know, all human societies, once there's economic surplus, are organized hierarchically. Right? So what does that mean? What that means is, we're going to dim the lights a little bit. Okay, what that means is the social goods produced by society are distributed unevenly. Right? So this, for example, is imprisonment rate as a function of race in the United States. Okay? So the tall bar are Black men. Okay. The small bar are, there you go, Hispanic men, and then you get white men and women down the bottom. Okay. This is the racial divide in unemployment over years, okay, up to 2010, and this is income by race. So I should say that I'm going to focus on race in this talk, but to be clear, my interest is in hierarchy broadly. So if you look at another society, you see the same trends across all these dimensions, right? So if you think about Australia, the Aborigines and whites, if you think about Africa, the Afrikaans and native South African groups. So in every society, you see these same types of trends across all sorts of dimensions, right? So it's not just income, it's income, health, life, imprisonment rates, educational outcomes, right? So across any number of dimensions, you see the same kind of breakdown as a function of your standing in the hierarchy. And so the question is, how come people aren't in the streets writing about this all the time, every day, right? So there should be inherent instability in hierarchies. Why would this be? Because if you are in a subordinate group, if you're a member of a low status group, there are a number of costs for you, right, that other people in society don't experience. That might make you unhappy or even angry, right? You might be mad. And if you're mad, why aren't you doing something about it, right? Why aren't you out in the streets protesting all the time? So what I argue is that for societies to be, and what I'm going to argue is that for societies to create stability, right? The United States is relatively stable, and Western societies, most of which are relatively stable. For societies to create that stability, you have to have pressure from the top, right? Because the interest of the people on the bottom is to change the system, so they should have interest in destabilizing the system. The people at the top of the hierarchy should have interest in stabilizing the system. So the question becomes, how do people on the top work to stabilize the system? That's what I'm going to focus on. just to be clear, psychologists have not always been particularly interested in that telling of the story. A lot of it has been why is it that people on the bottom aren't rising up? And so they've tried to explain why people on the bottom aren't rising up, which makes sense, right? Because you could argue that's more exciting. But I argue that a lot is missed if we don't think about the strategies or the psychology of the people on the top and how that contributes to stabilizing systems. What I'm going to suggest is that there are two broad ways to stabilize a system. And I'm going to simplify this a bit just for the sake of clarity. There's, on the one hand, the use of force. Right? So you can use force to stabilize a system. If you're on the top, you're benefiting from being on the top, and you're worried about people on the bottom becoming engaging in destabilizing behaviors, you might use force to oppress them, right? So you might use paramilitary and all sorts of ways that you might engage the resources that you have access to as people on the top of the society to oppress people on the bottom. But I and many political philosophers argue that is the least attractive of at least two broad alternatives. Because once you use force, you've undercut the productivity of people on the bottom. Right? So if I'm oppressing you, you're less productive, and as a member of the top, I've reaped the benefit to your productivity. That's a simple way to talk about it. So I shouldn't want to actively oppress you. What's better, I would argue, is acquiescence. That is, you try to engage people who are low status such that they participate in the system. Okay? And so this is where most psychologists focus. Why would members of low status groups ever participate in the system? Right? Again, I'm arguing that they should be motivated to destabilize the system because it doesn't benefit them, but there are obviously costs to destabilizing a system. That makes sense, right? So if you are, let's say, you're a member of a low status group, for some reason, society decides to, let you get into Princeton. So you get into Princeton, right? Are you now less likely to go out on the street and throw trash cans through plate glass windows? Probably, right? There's less motivation to engage in destabilizing behavior when you are more part of the system, when you have something to lose. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the interest of time here. So one, you need an ideology. We can talk about this, but I'm not going to spend much time on that. These two things I'm more interested in. If you're a member of the high status group, you have to pay attention to what members of low status groups are doing. Right? You're worried. You should give a constant need for vigilance. You believe that members of the low status group are interested in destabilizing the system. And you need to be vigilant for cues they're engaging in those behaviors. They might engage in those behaviors. So that's one thing I'm suggesting. There needs to be a degree of vigilance. And then finally, concessions. This is the one I'm talking about. If you get into Princeton, or if you're allowed possibly to buy a home, or if you think you can help your kids succeed, there's any number of things that the high status group might grant to lower status group members as a way of making a concession. Or if you're a woman in society, they might extend the franchise, so you're allowed to vote, right? So there's all sorts of places where we see high status groups engaging in behaviors that on the surface look to be outside of their direct interests, right? And the question is, why would this be? And what I'm going to suggest is that making concessions actually is a powerful way to generate acquiescence for three reasons. One, as I already noted, it increases the cost of destabilizing behavior. The more you have, the more it costs it is for you to disrupt the system that you exist in. The more you have, the more you're allowed to have, the more it costs you to engage in destabilizing behavior. It also exacerbates the collective action problem, meaning that high status groups are not concerned with the actions of any particular individual. What they have to concern themselves with is the collective action of low status group members. So if you can create a situation in which individuals are less likely to engage in collective action, that stabilizes the system. And so if you create the perception of a route to individual mobility, right, that should increase the problem of collective action. Right? You're less likely to engage in collective action if you see a route for individual mobility. And then finally, just through a basic desire or a basic motive towards reciprocity, when someone does something to help you, if you have that perception, you're less likely to do something that you think of as causing that person harm. Right? So if I make a concession, or if my group makes a concession to you, then it's relatively natural for you to be less interested in doing harm to me or to my group. Okay? So these three things, as a function of concessions, actually, I would argue, reduces the desire or reduces the likelihood of collective action that destabilizes the hierarchy. And so what I'm suggesting, in essence, is that high status groups, and I'm going to focus on race in this context, that whites have, at the very least, an implicit understanding of these dynamics. So I want to be clear that I'm not making a claim that people are sitting back and strategically thinking about this. What I'm suggesting is that human beings are incredibly sophisticated about hierarchy. So you find yourself in a context, and that context elicits a certain behavior from you. So if you're in a position of power, for example, and you're talking or engaging with someone, an individual who doesn't have very much, you might just automatically know it's not best to talk about how much stuff you have, right? Especially if that person looks bigger than you. Right? That might not be a good idea. Everybody gets that. Nobody has to tell you that, right? You don't have to think about that. What I'm suggesting is a similar type of psychology at a group level, right? There's just a context, right? You're in this context and people seem, things are happening, things are changing, you feel uneasy, and you just seems like you should support this policy or vote for this kind of candidate. Okay? And so what I'm going to focus on here, I have work that focuses on policies, but I'm going to focus on now, the research I'll show you, is about political choice, so supporting particular candidates. So what I'm going to suggest is that if you're in the dominant group, there are certain members of your group that when they run for office might destabilize the system a bit. They might provoke minorities, and in provoking minorities, increase the chances of destabilizing behavior. Right? And there are other candidates who are less likely to engage in those types of behaviors or elicit that kind of destabilizing behavior. Importantly here, it's not the reality if that's true or not, but your perception. Right? So if you're worried that things might change, I'm going to argue, if you're a white person, you should not want to vote for someone who you think would destabilize the system or provoke ethnic minorities. That's my argument. And so what I'm going to suggest is the desire for hierarchy stability can affect elites' preferences for leaders, and qualities of leaders can affect attitudes of low-status groups. And in particular, what I'm going to focus on is white racial identity. That is, if you have the perception that a political candidate is really identified with their race, you might assume that person is likely to engage in behaviors that would provoke minorities and therefore be less likely to support that candidate. That's the argument. So, and now I'm going to show you a couple studies. So in one study, we asked 125 white participants to look at a candidate, and we told them that the candidate had either high or low racial identity. So we manipulated that target candidate's white racial identity. And then we looked at perceived provocation. How much do you think this candidate would upset minorities? How racist is this candidate? And is candidate weird? Because white people that identify as white tend to be thought of as weirdos. So how weird is this person? And then finally, political support. Right, so is everybody clear on what I'm doing here? All right. So if you're interested, this is the racial identity manipulation. We showed participants these questions, and we had answers, presumably from the candidate, right? And we manipulated how strongly they identify with their identity or not. So again, what we're interested in idea is white racial identity, and this is political support. And what you see is a negative relationship. That is, the more strongly they think the candidate identifies as white, the less willing they are to support that candidate. So our white participants, the more willing the candidate is to identify as white in their perception, the less they support that candidate. Okay? Also, the more they identify as white, the candidate, the more people think that candidate is likely to provoke ethnic minorities, and the less they're willing to support that candidate. Okay, so this is the argument that we're making, that provocation of minorities reduces political support. And so we see that. Also, if you identify as white, people think you're racist. Okay? Racism, however, does not directly affect political support. That is, I think you're racist because you're white, but that doesn't really bother me that much. Everybody follow that? Like, yeah, you're racist, but it's okay. It doesn't affect my vote that much. And I would say that's probably a weak effect. My guess is that effect is real, but it's weak. But racism does affect perceived provocation. And it turns out that that's the route by which identity affects political support, or racism affects political support. So I see you're racist, and that's a problem because you're likely to provoke minorities, and therefore I don't vote for you. It's not a direct effect of racism. And also, they don't really think you're that awkward, so it's okay if you identify as white. People don't think you're weird, they just think you're racist. All right. So this is the first study. I'll just show you one more study. But what I think is interesting here, again, is that identity is associated with people's perceptions of both racism and provocation of minorities, but the effect of identity goes through perceived provocation. All right, in the next study, we looked at target racial identity. We measured, it says manipulated. We did manipulated here. What's the time here? Okay. Let me, I'll skip this one actually. I want to skip this one. If you're interested, I'll tell you about it. All right. This is, or ask me questions about it. This is a study of white Republicans. So these are actual candidates now. We're going to ask about real candidates in the current primaries. Everybody's following the primaries? Yeah, Super Tuesday was incredible, right? All right. So we have measures of white racial identity, like how much do you think this person identifies as white, hierarchy, threat, and then political support. And so this is the one about Rubio. So we changed the name, obviously, depending on which candidate we're asking about. So we asked about Rubio. Christie's was still in when we did it. He's now being held hostage. Trump, we asked about Trump. I think we even asked about Ben Carson, although nobody knows who he is. But the point is, each question is specific to the candidate. And so it was within subjects, if that matters. And what we find is, in essence, a replication of what I just showed you before, where identity affects hierarchy threat then affects political support, and that completely, presumably, mediates the effect of identity on political support. That is, it's about the reason perceived white identity affects political support is because it affects hierarchy threat. The other thing what's that? Oh, that should be negative. I'm sorry. Identity on political support should be negative. There should be a negative sign there. And that one too. Yeah, and hierarchy threat. I'm sorry, that should be negative as well. It's the same as before. Thank you. That was my mistake. And so the other thing I'll say about this, what I want to say about this is if you manipulate, this is an interesting phenomenon, if you manipulate stability, perceived stability, meaning you say, hey, in the United States, the political economic situation in the United States is not going to change in the next 10 years, or it is going to change in the next 2 years. You say nothing about race. When people think that things are not going to change, these effects go away. Right? So, and you see the same thing if you look at affirmative action. I could show you, that's what I decided not to show, but if you look at affirmative action, you could see the same sort of thing. So, for example, if whites that want to maintain the hierarchy find out that ethnic minorities don't like whites, they increase their support for affirmative action. So whites who want to maintain the hierarchy, they find out that minorities don't like whites, those whites actually increase their support for affirmative action. Right? Unless they think the hierarchy is stable, in which case that doesn't happen. Right? So again, the broader point I want to make here is that there is a sophisticated way that people understand how the hierarchy works. That my guess is, I don't have good evidence on this, my guess is it doesn't happen at a conscious level. There's just simply an understanding about how hierarchy works such that people understand the power of concessions. And they make them in a way that seems very sensitive to contextual cues, meaning is the hierarchy stable or not? Right? Are they likely to respond positively to these concessions? Those things affect how people respond to things like policy support that helps low status groups or seeks to avoid provoking low status groups. And I should say something else about, are we good? Okay. One more thing, not one more thing. I think it's interesting. I am really interested in the politics of Trump. So when we tried to publish this paper, because it didn't get published, someone said some version of, it's under review somewhere else though. Someone said, this can't be right. What about Trump? Everybody knows who Trump is. Okay. I just want to check. I don't know. Because again, my argument is that you could argue that Trump should not be popular if I'm right. Everybody follow that. That how could Trump be so popular if I'm right? So I think Trump is interesting for two reasons. Actually, I think as a person, he's not interesting at all. But his supporters are really interesting, I think. So, one, the elites really are not in favor of Trump, right? So, and that's interesting, given his degree of support among the base. The elites are not in favor of him. And in fact, even the National Review went so far as to have a special edition that was all about why you should not support Trump, right? So I think that's completely consistent with my argument, that people see. And if you look back, actually, the last election cycle, the Republican Party put out a memorandum, was like, what went wrong? And it was all about how we need to get more minorities into our Big Tent. And it was a large part of it was that, right? And so they see Trump as anti that position, right? And that's exactly what I'm talking about. The elites should not be supporting Trump. So the question is, why does Trump get so much support? So my argument about that is acquiescence, again, falls along a continuum. There's force on one end, there's acquiescence on the other, right? So the question becomes, when do you tip from trying to generate acquiescence through concessions to using force to maintain the system? What I would suggest is that when people feel uncomfortable in their own position, they feel really threatened personally, they're less interested in making concessions to generate acquiescence, and they're more interested in the use of force to generate greater stability in their own personal situation. And when you listen to Trump, his language is hugely a language of force, right? So kick all the immigrants out, kill the family members of terrorists. So when you think about what he's pushing, I would argue it's the use of force to generate to stabilize a hierarchy or create a hierarchy that people are afraid doesn't exist anymore. So my sense is that his supporters are afraid the country's moved away from them, right? They're no longer the center of the cultural context, and they're uncomfortable with that, and that Trump represents a forceful push against that movement, and that's why you see a lot of support for Trump. So again, the reason I point that out is I'm not suggesting that force is never used, or that people aren't interested in force. I'm suggesting, though, that it's interesting to see how people might use these more sophisticated mechanisms through, say, concessions to generate the same end, right? That if we're not thoughtful about hierarchy, we might take successes, what we might see as a success might really be going along with something that undercuts our own interests, right? So again, you think about affirmative action, or you think about candidates that seem moderate. Are those really in the interest of changing the way society is functioning? Perhaps, or perhaps not, right? And so I think careful consideration of how the hierarchy functions might shift how we understand the changes that we see. So with that, I'll leave it, and feel free to ask me questions after this.
Brian, I think, told a really compelling story about the surprisingly sophisticated, savvy ways that dominant group members, in particular whites, show their commitment for their material interests and try to preserve those interests. The other half of kind of collective story that Brian and I want to tell is how whites can do that and maintain a self-image as fair-minded, good people, because I think most people in this country want to at least maintain a self-image and express this image to others of not being bastards, right? How do whites sort of do all this stuff that Brian is talking about and sleep okay at night, look at themselves in the mirror? And I think that's a really interesting question because, as I hope you'll see, the ways in which whites do that have distinct consequences for efforts to increase equality. And in telling this story, I really like to start with a remarkable 1965 issue of Ebony magazine called The White Problem in America. And this is a riff on Gunnar Myrdal's The Negro Problem in America, which was written long before this. But this particular very provocative issue of Ebony magazine, if anyone's curious, you can get on Google Books, I think, and they have the entire thing scanned, and it's really well worth a read. It had one really famous essay by James Baldwin called The White Man's Guilt, but it also had a couple other really fascinating papers or articles like this one by the famous Kenneth B. Clark of the doll study fame. What motivates American whites? Deep-rooted insecurity prompts schism between U.S. creed and racial customs. Okay, there was even an ethnography of the typical white suburbanite pictured there, who's perfectly content as a bystander to the racial tensions that were raging in 1965. I think what's remarkable about this, and what really kind of inspires the model that I'm going to talk about, which is really, I think, kind of like a formal way of expressing these insights that long ago the editors of Ebony had, is this idea that there are psychological tensions created by white struggle for status and self-regard in what is supposed to be a fair society. None of this would make a difference if no one thought this was supposed to be or was minimally a fair society, a racially democratic, a meritocratic society. Because then you could pursue your material interests, hoard your privileges, and feel fine about it, because no one said it should be otherwise. It's just the way of the world. But that's not the way people see the country. And what you get is a situation in which whites are not indifferent to the negative implications of group privilege, okay? They are, to just sort of, riff on the title, they're not entirely zen about the whole thing. Or if you're a fan of The Big Lebowski, they're undued about this whole thing, right? And I think that's actually a point that requires elaboration, because the minute you start talking about this, you run up against a truism that comes out of sort of a bygone era in critical race theory and sociology especially, which we've called in one paper the Invisibility Thesis. And there's lots of versions of this. But it's the intuitive idea that whites are numerically, politically, socially dominant, and they represent the norm. In other words, membership in the dominant group is, by various adjectives, unmarked, invisible, transparent. It's hard to see. In more sort of social psych terms, whiteness is something called a cognitive default, only deviations from which really attract attention. And the upshot of this is that you wouldn't expect, it's true, whites to see themselves through a racial lens. And if they don't see themselves through a racial lens, how does Ebony's thesis make sense that they're sort of broken up about this in some way and are trying to deal with their issues in ways that have distinct implications for the hierarchy? Not surprisingly, we went to some pains to try to rebut this, or at least heavily qualify the invisibility thesis. I think on an anecdotal level, there's all kinds of things happening in society that cast doubt on this just right out the gate. Barack Obama's presidency is likely to make whites aware of their membership in the dominant group. Historical events like Rodney King, the beating of Rodney King, and shortly thereafter, Reginald Denny, the O.J. Simpson trial, Trayvon Martin, the Black Lives Matter movement. It's hard to think that whites, through media exposure to these things, aren't left with some kind of at least inchoate impression that they are in a distinct white group. Dog whistle politics plays on whites' awareness of their membership in the dominant group. Things like the Willie Horton ad, George H.W. Bush's Willie Horton ad. You probably all know about this. There's a distinct intergroup context here where Willie Horton was released on furlough by presumably Michael Dukakis and attacked a white family. Right? Jesse Helms' White Hands advertisement, where there's some white hands crumpling up, I think, a pink slip from an employer. The overdub is that the job was given to a minority because of affirmative action quotas. All these play on whites' intergroup emotions, and that wouldn't make any sense if whites were oblivious to their membership in the dominant group. And if kind of social psych empirical evidence is more your speed, you can point to any number of demonstrations of white identity in action. So white identity predicts opposition to policies seen as hurting the in-group, stuff that Brian and I and our colleagues have worked on together. White identification motivates whites to justify their superior social position by derogating minorities. It's been analyzed as coming in distinct, qualitatively different forms. It predicts a one-drop kind of hypo-descent tendency in racial categorization. And some evidence that came out fairly recently and I'm following up on, white identity increases the more time whites spend supporting the Tea Party movement. So you could see the Tea Party movement as an engine, a codification, codifier of white identity. So I'll leave it at that and just sort of put it out there that we don't believe this invisibility thesis. We think on implicit and increasingly explicit levels, whites are perfectly well aware of their membership in the white group and see themselves through a racial lens, whether they want to talk about it or not, or whether they want their leaders talking about it or not. And this kind of forms the basis of a model of what we call white identity management, which comes with a pretty cool picture. So if you buy it that the self and whiteness can come into contact, if there's such a thing as mainstream white identity, I'm not talking about fringe white identity like skinheads or Klansmen, I'm talking about white identity as a mass phenomenon, right? Our notion was that this causes two forms of self-threat. One which we term meritocratic threat and the other image threat, and that this in turn motivates three coping strategies. Two of them are good, and two of them are sort of bad, have bad implications for inequality, and one, which I may get to, is sort of like the upside to all this. There's time for a little good news. Probably won't be. We'll stick to bad news. All right, so white privilege is self-threat. I just want to sort of unpack this idea of two forms of threat a little bit. It's a truism in social psychology. Truism because it's true. I think truism doesn't give it enough credit. People want to take credit for their successes and avoid blame for their failures. This is called self-serving attribution, and people do it. That's immediately a problem. White privilege discounts internal attributions for success, and worse yet, augments internal attributions for failure. So if you're successful, white privilege is an indictment of how much credit you can take for that success. If you're unsuccessful, it's like you must really suck because you're this unsuccessful while white. And that's the augmentation principle, right? All right. Separately, people just prize equity as a virtue, right? This gets back to this idea that, we're sort of, inculcated into this cultural creed that this is a meritocracy, at least should be, and a racial democracy. And being a member of a group, being saliently aware of being a member of a group that's guilty of or profits from past and current sort of historical misdeeds and inequity current, right now, that makes people feel bad about their collective identity, right? We think these are kind of two separate types of threat. The first one we're calling meritocratic threat because it's very individualistic. It's how much do I as an individual get to take credit for what I've accomplished. And the second one is threat more at the collective self, right? I just don't like being in a group that you're telling me is privileged and got there by harming other groups, right? And I think the backdrop of this is really interesting, and it's a cultural norm in the United States. If we didn't sort of regard this as at least minimally a meritocratic society, none of this would matter. These kinds of threat wouldn't occur. And hopefully I'll show you a little evidence that it's that faith in, or that presumption that meritocracy is the law of the land that drives some of this, right? So we want to say that these two kinds of threat lead to coping strategies. Social psychologists have long studied the way people cope with threats, and we take that perspective here. So because I think in terms of pretty pictures, usually, I'm going to show you some. So this is meant to express the sort of joining of whiteness and the self-concept. So this is your sort of like picture of white identity right there. And here, attached to whiteness, you have the idea of privilege. When privilege and the self come into contact, this is going to be hyperbole a little bit, but I'm into PowerPoint animations. The self actually explodes. No more self. Goodbye, self. Nice knowing you. No, that's hyperbole. It does not annihilate white people's self-concepts, but it's not good for it either. That's totally unnecessary, but that's why I did it. So, given this threatening situation, self-threatening situation, what can you do? Well, you can cleave privilege from whiteness by just simply denying that privilege exists. That's a pretty good way to go if you can sleep. You can distance the self from whiteness, what we call distancing, one version of which is disidentification. I'll hopefully show you some evidence that happens. Or, and here's the good news, you can also separate privilege from whiteness by working to reduce privileges, by agreeing to give something up. And there's some evidence that in certain circumstances you can get whites to defend their collective identity by giving something up. Very different process, I think, than the kind of concessions you're talking about. It's worth making that distinction. So, denial. what evidence is there that whites do this? Well, there's actually a lot of it now. Some of it from us, some of it from other people. But I'll give you one example of a way of studying this that the way we've studied it. So it starts with this idea that denying threatening information is a simple and direct means of contending with threats to self-regard. In an empirical test, we figured that whites should be especially likely to deny privilege when the self is already vulnerable. So if we threaten whites in some particular way, and we see that they specifically deny privilege after that, even though privilege and the threat may not be connected, that's evidence of the threatening power of privilege itself. That was our experimental logic here. So if you make whites vulnerable, and then you see they deny privilege more than they otherwise would, it suggests that privilege would just be sort of adding insult to injury because it itself is threatening. So what we did was we took a sample of whites and gave them a bogus test, the personality test, the interpersonal and social skills test. And in an ostensibly unrelated study, we asked them questions about inequity. The independent variable here is a bogus feedback manipulation where we either told them that they were great, they scored 92nd percentile on a set of good traits like industrious and pleasant, and I don't remember all the traits, but relatively low on a set of bad traits. And in the failure condition, we just flipped it and told them that on the good stuff, they weren't very good, and on the bad stuff, they excelled. So our dependent variables in this were perceived white privilege and perceived anti-black discrimination. So throughout this line of research, we've made a distinction between two ways of framing inequity, which we think are sort of differentially threatening to members of the dominant group. You can construe inequality as my group has more than it deserves, or you can construe it as your group has less than it deserves. And throughout this, we figured that it's really that white privilege framing which militates against the self-concepts of whites. And we shouldn't necessarily see a similar effect for anti-black discrimination. And that's what we saw. So on the x-axis, you see the positive and negative test feedback. Right there, you can see that when given negative feedback about their personalities, whites actually subsequently thought that there was less white privilege in society than if you made them feel good about themselves. No effect for perceptions of the degree to which black people in society are discriminated against. Okay, again, we were making a really focused case that it's the privilege framing that threatens whites' self-concepts, right? And just really quick, in a second study, we did the same thing over again. I think we used a slightly different personality test, but the important addition was we added a measure of white identity, which basically, in so many words, asked people how important white identity was to their self-concepts. Very face value measure. And what we saw is that effect in which negative feedback decreases perceptions of white privilege, of in-group privilege, was really only pronounced among people who scored relatively high in white identity, okay? Which is exactly the people for whom identity and the self are proximate, like in that picture I showed you, right? It makes sense that it's these people that ought to care. All right, another study which I really like because it connects, I think, these processes to the background necessary cultural norm of meritocracy. We looked to the idea that the distal cause of privilege denial is acceptance of meritocracy as the proper distribution rule for society. Your inputs should be proportional to your outputs. And most people you find agree with this as a prescriptive norm. So we took a bunch of white participants, we did this awful bogus feedback thing again, and in an unrelated or supposedly unrelated story, again, asked questions about inequity. We had failure or success feedback, but as an additional independent variable, we measured their buy-in with meritocracy as a prescriptive norm. And there's a scale called the preference for the merit principle, which basically across about 20 items gets at people's sort of emphasis upon, yes, people's inputs should be no greater or less than their outputs. Okay, and then the DV here is perceived white privilege. And what we see is that I'll just focus you kind of on the difference between these 2 points. For individuals who really sort of buy into this cultural norm of meritocracy, it's them that ought to experience this, what we've called meritocratic threat. And that comes out, I think, in the distance between those bars. It's those people that you can get to deny white privilege by threatening them in a different way. Okay? I like this study because it really harkens back, I think, to the Ebony issue that said it's that tension, that psychological tension created by being in the dominant group in a world that's supposed to be fair, or at least in a country that's supposed to be fair. That doesn't feel good. One way of getting out of that is to deny that the world is unfair. All right. So whites deny privilege as a self-enhancing strategy, suggesting that privilege itself is threatening. This happens especially among individuals who strongly endorse meritocracy. And I will also, again, just note, it's not wholesale denial of inequity. Whites don't appear to find anti-black discrimination self-threatening. It's only this construal or framing that says my group has more than it's earned. Right? Consequences of denial. I think this has distinct and obvious consequences. I take it as an article of faith that reducing racial inequality will inevitably require whites to give something up to become okay with greater redistribution of social resources, socioeconomic resources. Whites who deny privilege probably won't like this idea. And I think it's also really interesting to note there's a lot of evidence coming out that denial is widespread and extreme, with many whites claiming that whites are not only not privileged, but they're actually systematically disadvantaged. So there was an amazing study by Norton and Somers with a representative sample of whites, where essentially if you ask them, think back to what you know about the year 1950. Who had it worse, whites or blacks? Whites will say, blacks, obviously. 1960, blacks somewhat, less. And then once you get to about 2000 or 2010, the lines cross and you find whites saying that actually discrimination against whites is a bigger social problem than against blacks. And some of my colleague Miguel Unzueta's work has demonstrated how incorrectly believing that organizations and universities use really aggressive minority quotas is actually a self-affirmation for whites because it's protective. If you fail and you think that the deck was stacked against you, it softens the impact of that failure. So all of this and other things suggest that denial is an extremely common, as I would call it, coping strategy for dealing with being a dominant group member in what is supposed to be a just society. All right. That is like the first way of coping with privilege on our model. I want to also argue that instead of separating privilege from whiteness, you can actually separate the self from whiteness. And we call this distancing. And I will, when threatened in a particular domain, we know that individuals can alleviate the threat by simply disengaging the self from that domain, okay, disidentifying from that domain. And an empirical test of this, whites should disidentify when feeling self-conscious about their group's position. This is one of several, I think, demonstrations of this distancing mechanism, but it's one that I like a lot. All right, distancing. So in this study, we took a sample of 90 whites. Participants were led to believe that they were going to converse with a partner about an assigned topic, and they were webcammed while they filled out some measures during the pre-interaction computer portion of the study. There was no actual interaction, but they thought so. So this was a 2x2 design. We manipulated via photo the race of the person that they thought that they were going to be interacting with. It was either a gender-matched black or white individual. And the topic, racial inequality. You're going to be assigned to talk about racial inequality with this person versus a control thing, which was earthquake preparedness. This was done in Southern California, so that actually made a lot of sense. The dependent variables here were nonverbal discomfort. Because we webcammed them, we could look at their videos. And they didn't know they were being webcammed, so I felt a little bad about that, but not that bad. So we were able to find out, signs of nonverbal discomfort, which are sort of well established in the literature, a lot of face touching, stuff like that, a lot of fidgeting. So we got a feel for how much nonverbal discomfort they were experiencing, and also gave them an implicit measure of white identity that I and my colleague Kai-Ping Pong developed a while back, which is an implicit association test. Hopefully I don't have to say too much about that. It's a word association test that measures the strength of the cognitive association, in this case, between things that denote me and the white category. Okay? All right, so I decided not to show you this actual video, but here is a still from one of our participants. So she's going along reading the directions, and then at some pre-designated point, she finds out that she is going to be talking to an African-American student about race. Could have been a white student about race, or a white student about earthquakes, or a black student about race. Right? And our dependent variable here is levels of implicit white identity. So the hypothesis is that that combination of talking about race with a member of the subordinate group is going to be self-threatening for whites. And we're going to see some sign of implicit sort of disidentification with the white group. I think that's what we found. So on the x-axis, we have conversation topic, and on the y-axis, again, our DV of implicit white identity, that IET score. We can see, perhaps not surprisingly, that when you give people a racial topic to talk about, even if it's a white partner, talking about a racial topic kind of primes implicit in-group identity. I don't think that's too terribly surprising. Right? Also, talking with a black partner about anything, in this case earthquakes, also seems to prime in a big way white identity at the implicit level. The interesting thing for us was this bar, okay? So if you sort of take account of the fact that just talking to a black partner sort of brought implicit white identity up, it's the difference between those black partner bars which is really interesting. When talking about racial inequality, identity scores were actually significantly less in the black partner condition than talking about the control topic, right? And so we think that this is evidence of some implicit process of distancing the self from the threatening identity, right? These two bars. And in what I'll talk to you about next, I'm just going to focus on what's happening in the black partner condition, right? Animation fail. That shouldn't be up there yet. I'll just stick it all up there. All right. So remember, we measured nonverbal discomfort, and we were able to get reliable codes of that. We found that in the racial topic condition compared to the control topic condition, this is nothing new. This is actually what I just showed you in coefficient form. White identity was lower. Right. Interestingly, also, white identity was positively associated with nonverbal discomfort. Okay, so what this did was set up this, what we think is a buffering pattern, where having to talk, as a white person, having to talk with a black person about this uncomfortable subject, which ensnares your dominance, as a white person, that actually causes you to disidentify. And because the association between identity and discomfort is positive, that actually reduces your nonverbal discomfort. So it makes you feel better, right? In terms of like your fidgeting and your face touching and all these signs of nonverbal discomfort. And interestingly, there was no sort of overall effect. If I just correlated topic with nonverbal discomfort, there was not a significant association. What there was a significant direct effect, such that net of the pathway from topic to disidentification to discomfort, there was a positive relationship between talking about race and being uncomfortable. What this is like a suppressor effect, basically. It says that, but for the fact that whites in the black partner condition who had to talk about race, but for that fact that they disidentified, they would have been displaying more nonverbal discomfort. And we think that this is evidence, A, that this really is uncomfortable for them, but also that to the extent that whites are responding to the situation by disidentifying, they free themselves from that discomfort. It's a lot to read into a bunch of regressions, but that's what we do. All right. So to summarize that, whites showed decreased implicit identity when about to talk to a black partner about inequity versus about a race-neutral topic. And there's some evidence, at least, that this is self-protective. Topic-induced disidentification decreased whites' nonverbal discomfort. All right? Okay, I think I have just a couple minutes. Maybe I'll try to get in some good news. So we call this other way of separating privilege from whiteness dismantling, largely because it starts with a D. But it works, right? So what do we mean by that? Well, it's the idea that whites can, conceivably, in some situations, if you can design the situation right, alleviate the threat of privilege by adopting attitudes and behaviors that reduce white privilege. So, for instance, supporting affirmative action that actually entails whites losing something, losing access, losing preferred access to housing or jobs or some other social good. In other words, relinquishing resources through supporting redistributive policies such as affirmative action that whites usually see as costing the white group. All right, so in this study, a sample of white participants read a description of a fictitious company, called Strathmore International, that had instituted an affirmative action policy. The independent variables here were inequity frame. We had told subjects that an internal audit found that Strathmore advantaged whites or disadvantaged blacks. Here's that framing idea again, that whites are particularly sort of skeeved by the idea that they are recipients of unearned privileges rather than the outgroup being deprived. And an outcome frame manipulation where the policies instituted by the company either resulted in a drop in the white workforce or an increase in the black workforce. Right? So framed the effects of an affirmative action policy in terms of the cost to the white group or the benefit to the black group. Okay, and then support is, the DV is support for affirmative action. What we see here, you have those three inequity frame conditions. You had a control condition, and then again that black disadvantage condition and white advantage condition, and then the outcome frame is crossed with that. Either this is benefiting the supporting group, or it's costing my dominant group. And so the idea here is, can we find a situation where whites will actually prefer a policy framed as hurting them to a policy not so framed? And they don't do it if you don't work on framing the inequity at all. In the black disadvantage condition, they do what we've seen in other research, which is prefer or not prefer something costing the white in-group. But in this third condition, where you tell them that there's inequity in the organization and it favors the in-group, in this case we see whites actually significantly preferring something that is described to them as hurting their own group. And there's some evidence in this paper that that effect is mediated by a sense of collective self-esteem, so that whites are doing this in order to alleviate what I earlier called a group esteem threat. It's like, to tell me that this organization has systematically preferred members of my in-group, that presumably makes me feel bad about my collective identity as a white person. And in this situation, you can actually flip the usual pattern of, like, I don't support something that you're telling me is going to hurt us, to preferring a policy that you're telling me is going to hurt us, if that promises to restore collective self-esteem, right? And I've kind of thought, and we've written sort of longish paragraphs about like how to set up circumstances such that you can get whites to support in-group costly policies as a means of sort of restoring the honor of the in-group. I think that's a very delicate and complicated question, because I think what we see is that just denying the existence of inequity or sort of disidentifying or distancing the self from whiteness is just an easier thing to do. It's a heavier lift to get whites to arrange the situation just so you can get them to be like, you know what, okay, I'm going to do this for the good name of my group. All right, so I think we see evidence that when induced to frame inequity as white privilege, whites can be made to embrace policies specifically that they expect will harm the white in-group. This appears, as I mentioned, to reflect the damage done to collective self-esteem by white privilege. Okay, I'm going to end it there. Thanks to all these folks, and thanks to you guys.
Okay, thank you very much. We now have a chance for us all to ask them questions. And since I have the mic, I'm going to ask the first question, and then I'll call on people from the audience to ask questions. Okay, so this is actually a question to both of you. In listening to your talks, what was interesting about them to me was that they portrayed white people as, in some fundamental way, not really caring about or even paying any attention to black people, right? White people want their privilege, they want their material well-being, they want their psychological well-being. Sometimes their relationships with, what they do to black people kind of gets in the way of that. In which case they adjust, right? But it's not a strong. They're not paying that much attention to black people, right? They don't hate them. It's not a prejudice story. They mainly just want what they have, and maybe more of it, right? Is that a fair representation of your data? Or is that the part of the story you're telling? With the other part there, but not part of the story you're telling, or is that a misrepresentation? And you can go in any order you want.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
There we go.
Should I elaborate on that?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Look, I think of myself as a pretty simple guy, right? That people are interested in their own lives. Like, you get up, you think about what you have to do for work. If you have kids, you worry about your kids. If you have class, you worry about doing what's going on in class. Maybe you worry about making some more money or whatever. But I don't think that most people walk around thinking about other groups or their own group unless they're forced to, right? Unless something confronts them and they're forced to examine it. And I think that when sometimes I'm forced to examine it, people are resentful that they're being forced to examine it. But I think that, I think the focus is certainly in psychology on prejudice and discrimination has been overdone. I think that is, if anything, like a consequence that becomes maybe a predictor of outcomes. But in the end, I think people are trying to manage what they have. They're trying to get more, and they want to feel good about it. And there are consequences to that because of the way things work out. The social political history of a society makes there's consequences to just wanting to have what you have. But I don't think there's a huge effect of people actively waking up in the morning wondering how they can step on somebody. I just don't think that's how people work.
I would agree with that. I think a lot of this was, we pitched it as a reaction to the emphasis on sort of outgroup focused explanations for whites' political preferences and their behavior. I think that was exaggerated. I really like what Brian said, that certainly prejudice exists and cannot be ignored. Animus happens, right? We're seeing that, I think, in a big way right now along religious lines in this country, especially with Trump and talking about barring Muslims from entering the country. Animus happens, right? I think though that what you said is that maybe we ought to think of that as more of an outcome rather than a predictor, right? Again, in the sense that it's ingroup concerns and even prior to that self-concerns that take priority, because people are egocentric animals, and a lot of times pursuing those ingroup or egocentric concerns results in animus. But I think it's interesting to think of it more endogenously to this whole more in-group focused process, and so I think that's kind of where we're placing it in the stream.
Questions?
So this is mainly a question for Professor Lowery. So you talk about your results as if they represent that people tend to, white people want to engage in hierarchy maintenance, but it seems that your results could also be interpreted simply for preferences for equality, increasing equality, especially when we're talking like the last study by Knowles. How do you differentiate between preferences for equality and preferences for equality because driven by a preference for hierarchy maintenance?
Right. So this is the cost of not showing more data, I guess. So when you manipulate perceived stability, the effects go away. So if you were really concerned about helping the group, if you thought your situation was stable, that should make no difference, right? But when you think things are not going to change, then all of a sudden you're not interested in supporting affirmative action more, for example. So you can imagine, so understanding, so let me talk about it the way I understand you're asking the question. So for example, the affirmative action stuff I talked about but didn't show. Like if you find out the group doesn't like you, you might take that as evidence that that group is not doing well, and so you should help that group, right? And so increasing your support for affirmative action could be, I think what you're suggesting is an honest way of trying to help that group because they're not doing well. And what I'm suggesting is that could be true, except that when you think things aren't going to change for you, you're no longer interested in helping that group, even though nothing has changed for that group. And so if it was honest concern for that group, you should be interested in helping that group independent of your likelihood of anything happening to you, but you don't see that. And two, you see these effects most prominently among people who actually like hierarchy. So if you have a scale of like, do you like hierarchy or not, this is an oversimplification, but this is close enough. It's the people who say they like hierarchy who engage in these behaviors, not the people who say hierarchy is bad. So, and I should just point out that for a few people who know me, I lean towards cynicism. So, I'm sure. So I'm sure I don't deny the possibility that people could honestly help. I just think people are selfish, selfish creatures, and that they're worried about themselves. That they want to feel good about themselves. So there are ways to construct situations where people will engage in behaviors designed to help others. I think you can do that, but I don't think that is necessarily the natural state of affairs. Like once you have stuff, the chance of you giving it up simply because you think someone else needs it, that's the only reason, is relatively low. Can it happen? Yes, but it's low. And so when you see that kind of behavior happening, I ask myself, like, why are they doing that?
Yeah, I mean, we have some evidence that I think speaks to this, where we showed white subjects' affirmative action policies, and we measured how much they received that policy as harming the white ingroup or benefiting the in this case, the black group, I think. And it's not that we couldn't find evidence that the white subjects wanted to benefit the black outgroup, but we only saw evidence for that if they didn't think the policy was going to harm the white ingroup. So it's like ingroup first, and then if we're fine, if this doesn't do anything to hurt us, then sure, yeah, I want to see you benefit, right? Unfortunately, I don't think it's a natural state of affairs for whites to see policies as not hurting them. Ingroup, and in a lot of cases, effective redistributive policies do hurt the white group in some wide sense, right? Like, that's kind of like, that's what redistribution means. So, you can show that, they don't mind making the world a better place for the supporting group, but you can also show that that's contingent upon first determining that we're okay. And I see that as pretty consistent with what we know about people, just generally.
Gail?
I wonder how these findings interact with multiple identities. So, I'm white, so I'm advantaged, but I'm a woman, so I'm disadvantaged, or, SES, etc. And I can see that as going both ways. So on the one hand, because I can see myself as disadvantaged in some other way, I can protect myself from feeling advantaged and kind of distance myself from being white or from that identity, kind of suppress that identity. On the other hand, it gives you more empathy towards other disadvantaged groups. So you might think, anything that helps disadvantaged group in some way will help me because I'm also disadvantaged. So I wondered if you had any results on differences, gender differences, for instance, in your studies, or just any interaction between these very strong identities, especially in kind of workforce and education, so the gender identity is as strong, I can imagine, as racial identity.
Let's see. No, we find no gender effects. That's an easy answer. the multiple identities question is a good question. So I think that people can identify in a number of ways, and depending on how you identify, it's going to change the psychology you engage in, right? Because it changes the group, it changes the status of the group relative to other groups. That part I think is relatively straightforward. I don't have the evidence for that, but that's what I would predict. I think there's pretty good reason to expect that. But there's something more complicated that you suggested, which is like the intersectionality of identities, and that becomes a lot more complicated. So if you say, do you see yourself as a woman or do you see yourself as white, that's pretty straightforward. But then when you start asking what happens when you say yourself as a white woman, now it becomes a lot more complicated, I think. So I don't have great answers for the intersectionality in terms of the effect of intersectionality on our effects. What I'll say is I'm intrigued by them, but I have not. This is kind of a joke that it's probably politically incorrect, but I'll be Trumpian about it. I've been fascinated by the psychology of white women because I just can't figure it out. I just can't make sense of it. And that is about intersectionality, just because it's an interesting position to be in, right? So if you think about gender and race in a simple binary way on each side, right? So if you're a black woman, it's pretty clear. If you think of an additive hypothesis, and not everyone agrees with that, you're on the bottom, it's clear what your interest should be. If you're a black man, you could also make kind of the same argument that there still is that intersectionality is complicated because you have the male, you have the gendered privilege, but you don't have the race privilege. But then it's really the gender privilege only is within community, let's say. You might experience it that way. If you're a white man, it's really clear. The question becomes, when you're a white woman, how do you manage that, right? So you have to accept subordinate status to benefit from the dominant status. That's what I argue. And that is just a complicated position to be in. And it's hard for me to make sense of in a very clear way. I've looked at things, but I've not been able to really grasp what the consequence of that position is. So it's just an interesting case to be in a position where you have to, on the one hand, be willing to accept a subordinate status to really reap the full benefits of a dominant status. So for me, that's the intersectionality that I'm most interested in. And I use white women as a joke because it's the easy, in the context of race and gender, it's easy, that's where it occurs, but you can imagine in other hierarchies it would occur some other place. But I think I don't really have the answers to how that plays out. So I wish I had better answers than I do.
Can you follow up on why white women have to accept their subordinate status in order to gain any benefit?
So I should have said, I didn't say that. I said that more strongly than I meant to. What I would say is that I would argue there's a dependency of the racial hierarchy is tied to in ways that create dependency to the gender hierarchy. That's what I'm suggesting in saying that it's hard to fully disentangle them. If you believe that's true, then to benefit from being white, and that if you believe that those benefits primarily accrue to white men, that the best way to benefit as a white woman, perhaps if you want to go make it really strong, the only way to benefit as a white woman is to tie yourself to the outcomes of white men. Like that you don't have to accept that, but the idea that there's some connection between gender and racial hierarchy, which I think there's reasonable evidence for, suggests that there may be some truth to that. And if that's the case, then the way that what you would end up doing would be in a situation where you have to accept being a woman and what that meant, unless white men were willing to give up their gender advantage. And it's not clear why the person at the very top would do that. Does that make sense? So if you're a white woman and you want to benefit from, let me say it in a crasser way. This will be easier.
Oh God.
No, it's not bad. It's not bad. Imagine, here's an easy way to imagine. Imagine it's 1960s, right? And you're a white woman. It's good. That's good. But if you're not married to a white man, it's not so good. Like you can't open your own bank account. You know what I mean? There's clear ways in which, yes, you benefit, but you benefit in large part because of your connection to white men. If you look at wealth outcomes in the United States, white women are wealthier in large part because of marriage to white men. Like there are a lot of outcomes, and this is really an indictment of gender in this country. This is not really, I don't feel like I'm saying much about race. It's the same. It's true that being married clearly increases a woman's outcomes, and that's less the case in certain low status communities because men in those communities are, for example, incarcerated at higher rates. But certainly within the white community, marriage clearly increases your financial outcomes. That's pretty clear.
Your earnings yourself or your family?
No, no, not your earnings yourself, no, but your access to resources. Let's say it that way. So if you think of privilege as access to resources, that increases. So this is why I said that to do that you might have to give up or accept a subordinate status because your earnings might go down. I'm not making a claim about that. I'm sure somebody has that data. I don't have that data, so I'm not making a claim that you are the equal in that necessary relationship. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. I don't know. But I'm saying that your outcomes are going to be better by connecting to the highest status person, and that would be in the context of the United States, that would be white men, right? So there's the male benefit and there's the racial benefit, and that connection is beneficial, and it's going to be beneficial more to the high status group because the men in that group are going to have access to more resources than it's going to be to a low status. That's the claim.
So if you take that argument outside the gender realm and put it into the class realm, you would expect lower socioeconomic status white men to be more supportive of high status white men than.
Probably yes, and I think you see some of that in voting. Also, I think, for example, too, you see less interest, for example, in marriage among low-class people of all groups, right? So if you think still in terms of gender and class, right, there's less benefit, you're less likely to engage in the institution of marriage. And now, for example, it's for a while, just going back to marriage for a second, it was clear there was a huge difference in marriage rates for African Americans and for whites, and that large part of that was class. And now you're starting to see that the same kind of function happen, the same kind of patterns occurring among the white community. People are responding to that differently, but you could argue it's the same effect is going on, right? I'd marry when there was benefit to being married, and now there's less benefit. If you're low SES, I'm less interested. You see the same thing.
This is more of a technical question, but for your distancing mechanism, do you find some sort of an identity compensation effect by which I'm less white, but I'm more academic?
I don't know. We haven't looked at that. I like that idea, though. I think identity feels good, right? And so that might be part of the way this plays out, is that you're re-identifying with other sort of non-racial identities, but we just don't have any data on that at all. But it could be. I think, it's probably true.
Yeah, I was just wondering if either of you could say a few words about how you feel your work might intersect with, I guess, what I might call the historical, in the sense that, I'm interested in this idea of, dismantling of privilege and how it seems to kind of erupt in in certain situations. I mean, you could look at American history and say, well, why did, at a certain point, the social, try to dismantle Jim Crow, or try to dismantle, or try to enact, reforms in the 60s or whatever, which I know are arguable that those had an impact. But how, I guess what I'm interested in is like how is it possible to transpose any of your findings to kind of an historical arc of how the country evolved?
I think that's really interesting, and I think I know some people talk about like the interest convergence hypothesis. Talking about how the civil rights movement couldn't have occurred if it weren't for the Cold War, and sort of the moral imperative of demonstrating, our, moral superiority to the communist regimes, right? And I think like there's a way of seeing that as kind of like the process that we think we saw in the dismantling study in action is that there's this sort of exogenous threat to the collective identity of, I think, white America as the sort of the dominant group in the country. So it wasn't the inequity itself which caused a desire to sort of cleanse the honor of the in-group by dismantling Jim Crow and civil rights and doing civil rights. But it's sort of in the same spirit, right? Like there was this exogenous threat to our moral identity as a nation, and I think more specifically to sort of the power structure in the country of white Americans. And they thought, like, well, we have to fix this. We have to fix this, or we have no leg to stand on when we argue that our democracy is better than communism. So that would be a starting point for me to think about how, I think the interest convergence hypothesis is going to be about collective seeing in a way. What do you think?
Yeah, okay. I'm more cynical. So here's what I think. The interest convergence. No, that's so the interest convergence hypothesis is really that whenever you see the dominant group engage in behavior that seems to benefit the subordinate group, it's almost certainly because it benefits the dominant group to do so. Right. So there's an interest convergence. Like my interest as the dominant group converges with your interest as the subordinate group. And so the way that argument typically is described is Cold War. We needed to have international esteem to get anything done. That Jim Crow laws were hurting our international esteem, and for reasons that had to do with global politics, we started to dismantle Jim Crow. That it had nothing to do with the morality of Jim Crow laws. And so there's a whole book written on that particular thing. But the hypothesis broadly, when you see the dominant group engage in behaviors that seem to benefit the subordinate group, you should look for the interest of the dominant group in that. That's the claim. I mean, it's a great question. I think about the sweep of history and the shifts in societies, and how can you account for these shifts in the context of group interests, right? So how can you see, for example, if women didn't have the vote, why should they ever get the vote if men control who has the franchise? Like, how does that happen? And so what I've come to most recently is that when people make concessions, and I think concessions are made because there's pressure on the dominant group to do so. So I don't think it's ever. I personally, this is the most cynical version. I don't think it's ever done purely out of moral rectitude. I think they're forced to do it. But what's interesting is you can't always predict the consequences of making those concessions. So you make the concessions in the moment, thinking like, okay, this is a concession that's going to help manage the situation, but you can't see far enough into the future in terms of what's going to happen. So there's slippage. So, for example, when women, the franchise was given to women in this country, the people who did it I don't think they had in mind what the situation we live in now, where women are independent voters, really. So I think they had in mind that only wives would vote, and their husbands would clearly dictate who they vote for. And they thought it was a joke. They just didn't take seriously women as an independent political force. And they couldn't see where we are now, right? They didn't have the foresight to understand the consequences of that concession fully. And so once that happens, you make this concession, and there's slippage, it's hard to know what's going to happen. So I think that creates a little bit of indeterminacy in the system. And when that's exploited, I think that's how you get major social change. So there are concessions made. People underestimate or don't understand the consequences of those concessions because social systems are incredibly complex. And things change in ways that are hard to predict, right? So you end up with, a black president. I'm sure that wasn't the intent of any number of decisions that were made along the way that allowed that to happen, but you can't predict what the consequences of all those decisions are going to be. And so I think that's how you end up with change, and I think that's how I think about the sweep of history. Like as you think about shifts in the social context, that's how I think about how that occurs.
I have a question for us. Can I ask a question?
Go for it. I've never seen that done before, but please.
Okay, I'm going to go over there.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I mean, I hang out with a lot of moral psychologists, and they're very,
Why are you keeping that kind of company?
And they like to point out, and I think there's evidence for this, that people don't like to, see things as unfair. They have a natural, sort of they're attuned to other suffering. And that could, arguably provide a less cynical, more moral reason to want to help outgroups, to help others as individuals. Like, does that create any space for dominant group members to do good in the social justice sense in a way that is not demonstrably tied to their own interests?
No. No, he's a slightly longer answer. I have no idea what people are talking about when they talk about fairness. No concept what they mean. No idea. I really don't. Like, I think of it as, like, fairness is dictated by the ideology you accept. Now, once you accept an ideology, then I can say, like, all right, I get what you mean by fairness. And once you have that ideology, yes, that ideology constrains you, right? Once you accept an ideology because there's benefits in accepting that ideology. So you accept the idea of meritocracy because it makes you feel good about things because you think society runs better because of whatever, blah, blah, blah. You accept it, and you accept it so deeply that you assume that what is fair in the concept of that ideology is, in some sense, objectively fair. That fairness exists out in some sort of platonic ideal of fairness out there. And that's nonsense from my perspective, right? That the ideology exists above your idea of fairness and justice. Once you accept an ideology, then it dictates what's fair and just. And that once that's dictated, that constrains your behavior. Yes. So if you want to feel like a good person, you accept the ideology of meritocracy, then yes, you're constrained in terms of how you can explain things, how much you can extract, how you can extract those things from other people, what you have to do to justify what you have. All those things become a part of how you see yourself. That's only because you've accepted this ideology. There's nothing inherently moral about it. I told you, stop hanging out with those people. What about it?
Talk amongst yourselves.
All right, so welcome, join me in thanking our speakers.